Good afternoon and welcome to DeHavilland's discussion about how public affairs professionals can get the most out of parliamentary candidates during the general election campaign and beyond. I'm Rebecca Evans, I'm the Director of Content at DeHavilland, and I'm delighted to be joined today by two guests who have a wealth of experience in public affairs and also in Westminster. So we'll be able to talk through what works and potentially what doesn't in terms of engagement from both perspectives. To introduce them, we have Graham Evans, Senior Counsel at Airbus UK and MP for Vale between 2010 and 2017. And Vanessa Pine, co-founder of Atlas Partners and formerly Special Advisor to Savint's Cable and Joe Swinson.
Hi.
Hi there. So to dive straight in, at DeHavilland we've spent the last few weeks gathering all these details of prospective parliamentary candidates, or PPCs as we'll probably end up calling them in this conversation, names and contact details and so on, and obviously the lists of those people who were standing were finalised last week. Before we delve into how it is best to engage, Graham, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about, at this stage in the campaign as a candidate, what's going on? What does a day look like? What's expected of a candidate? Sort of paint us a bit of a picture about what that's like.
Well, first of all, you get butterflies in the stomach, you lose your appetite, but you're up at the crack of dawn, to bed after midnight, so lack of sleep. It's a mixture of excitement. I could be a member of Parliament, who knows, you're in with a real chance. There's an excitement there, and you live off adrenaline. Mm-hmm. Now, this is quite a short campaign. Yeah. I was elected 3 years before an election, so you had 3 years to run up to it. But many of the candidates in this election would have been selected last week, and now they're in the middle of this this very interesting election campaign. So they will have a huge amount of emotions swirling around. When they wake up in the morning, their wake up and worry is, am I going to win this? Am I going to get round the constituency? So you do get very excited but very worn out. It's very stressful.
Is it quite hard to navigate at that stage?
Well, for candidates who were selected last week, they will not know the constituency unless they live there. Many of them would be local candidates, which they have an advantage. But if you've been selected in London and you're in Manchester or the North West or whatever, you're in a strange town trying to fathom out, make sure you get the town's names right and the wards and the areas and the peculiar names to the area. You need to get those right because local people and the electorate spot that a mile off. So you need to become local very quickly.
Yes. And for most people it's a strange experience because your diary doesn't belong to you anymore. It's hotly contested. Your time, I'm sure you will have found this, that you've got constituency campaign meetings, you've got time on the doorstep, you've got literature, you want to be trying to do media, then you've also got to be communicating with HQ and national. So the amount of time in your day feels really constricted, and actually then having to prioritise that time probably becomes really challenging on an individual basis, and you as a candidate have to set your intention for that, I think. I don't know if that was your experience.
Yes, your diary will be filled by other people, and if you're inexperienced, you'll be dancing to other people's tunes. With a little bit more experience, you manage to pick out what is urgent and what's in.
And how do you do that? How do you discern, or how would you advise?
Experience is a wonderful thing. My advice to a candidate that was selected last week and they find themselves in a marginal seat, because if it's a safe seat, you're going to win. You know you're going to win, and therefore the pressure is different to somebody who is going to win that seat. If it's a marginal seat, that's the exciting thing. So my advice is to get down in the high streets, look at the communities where you can make maximum impact quickly. So that's where people are. So high streets, housing estates, communities where you can quickly knock on the doors over the next three weeks, so you can get maximum
It's all about the impact, yeah.
It is the impact. And leaflets are so important. Now, these candidates will not have a leaflet yet, so they'll be literally knocking on doors with generic literature.
I've had 3 through from the Lib Dems already.
Yeah, well, I was going to say Lib Dems are particularly, from my experience, very effective at this, but I learnt my trade from the Lib Dems, so I used to make my own literature and not wait for the party literature to come from, because you have rules and regulations on what you can and cannot put in literature, but most new candidates will not know that, and they'll be patiently waiting for the official literature with their face on it. But with experience, you go and do your own, but you have to watch out for the expenses and don't go over budget.
I think it makes a big difference as well whether you're an incumbent or whether you're a challenger.
Yes.
And how you organise yourself around those two different kind of agendas and priorities. If you're an incumbent, you've got a record of delivery that you want to be highlighting. If you're a challenger, you need to establish name recognition. I mean, they both want to be doing the same things, being seen in places of really high footfall, but new challengers probably looking for more sort of guerrilla style tactics, ways to cut through, because the name recognition of established candidates is a real mountain to climb.
Absolutely, yes. So with all that going on, when you've then got public affairs teams, whether they're back in the office or potentially a bit more out and about, when they're wanting to engage with parliamentary candidates, what is it that they'll be looking to achieve during this campaign period?
Well, a public affairs department worth its salt will understand that the relationship we've had with the relevant MPs that affect the company, they're either staying and they're in safe seats, so they know that their contacts in a given constituency will remain because they're in a safe seat. However, there may be a retirement and standing down. Therefore, we need to look very carefully at that seat to see who may possibly win it. So any public affairs professional will be looking at those seats where they can hone in their attention. So you may have one or two people within that constituency where they really should put some time and effort to approach and make themselves known to those candidates, because they will be the MP and they will be the MP representing their business or whatever. And so the trick for me is fine-tuning that. However, in marginal seats, who knows where it's going to go? And so you need to be careful on who you choose to look at, which constituencies, and there could be 2 or possibly 3 candidates that could be the MP. So any professional PA person should be looking at that very carefully, phoning them and approaching them delicately, because as I say, if you've been selected as an MP last week and you're getting phone calls from public affairs people, they will not understand what you're perhaps trying to achieve, so you've got to be very careful. However, if you offer them a visit to your plant or your supermarket or whatever, I think that would be most welcome, because if they can take photographs, any candidate will say yes to having a photograph in a well-known local employer, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as Graham says, there are basically 3 tips. There's get in early, think about your targeting, and then also think about whether you can be doing things with leaders' visits as well. So having worked on the 2010 and 2015 general election for the Liberal Democrats, I know that Nick Clegg went on all sorts of visits to all sorts of different factories and supermarkets, and some corporate organisations had a policy where they would say, no, we don't want visits from anybody, because they felt that there was an issue of neutrality. Others took the view that if you offered the invitation to everybody, then anyone was free to turn up, and those who did were fine. So, and you'll have seen George Osborne, in his high vis, wearing his hard hat at all sorts of places, Britvic factories, cider farms in Somerset. Yep. And I think those provide really nice visuals from the broadcaster's perspective. HQs are happy because they are able to send their leaders or VIPs around the campaign trail, doing something interesting and engaging with real voters. From the local PPC's perspective, it means they are, there's buzz around their campaign, so the activists are happy and excited, and I think there's a real opportunity there for corporate public affairs people to be thinking about how they could be the backdrop. And then in terms of sort of targeting marginals particularly, so at Atlas Partners we're working with the Humane Society International on a Fur Free campaign, and we are targeting particular PPCs, and as you say, you have to think very carefully about who you're speaking to. So where incumbents are standing down or where the seats are very marginal, we are actually using their network of supporters locally. So any PPC worth their salt is going to pay more attention to issues that are of importance to their local voters, and the more marginal your seat is, the more you're prepared to chase those issues that are relevant locally. Yep. But even issues like Fur Free, which is an issue that can, matters across the country. A few votes here or there, emails from your local constituents saying, dear PPC, I really care about this issue and I want to talk to you about it. So we're then following up on Twitter from the corporate handle, so you're engaging sooner rather than later. And I think one of the things that a PPC who was successfully elected said to me after she had won in Wells, that she remembered people who had spoken to her before. So people who had taken the time to engage with PPCs before they were MPs were given credit in her mind, because actually lots of people write after people are elected. Yeah. But if you've taken the time to speak to that person, to seek a meeting with that person, to talk to them about the issues, ideally that are relevant to them locally, that counted in her mind, which is interesting.
So how are public affairs teams within the campaign sort of measuring their success? What does good look like at this point, and how can they best lay the ground for for that relationship a bit later?
Well, I would suggest after the election, if you've been very professional, how you've approached what was the candidate at the time,
Yes.
and they are now the Member of Parliament. That's the whole point, that you've got to think after the election, have I approached this individual in a professional way? For example, you could say, if you're knocking on the doorsteps and people ask about our company, can we give you some lines to say, this is the update on whatever the issue will be. So if they become the MP, you can say, if you remember before the election we met and I'd like to invite you to have a coffee meeting or whatever it is, or visit our plant in your formal capacity.
So giving people information, MPs information about things
Yes.
that they definitely will get
Yes.
asked about on the doorstep. Or
And politics is a people
of course,
business, and I'm a people person, so people like to be treated with respect. We're not robots or the candidates are not robots.
Yeah.
So it's how you approach it. Is it just a Me Too letter or a Me Too correspondence? If it's this can only be on individual style, but you have to treat people with respect and know that they are under a huge amount of pressure. And I think parliamentary candidates will appreciate the way they're being approached. I know you're busy, I know you've got other things on your mind, but perhaps you might find this brief helpful for when you're knocking on doors or whatever.
To what extent, when candidates are sort of entering the campaign, again, this may be different for incumbents and challengers, but to what extent have people already sort of picked the issues that they're likely to talk about a great deal, or is there scope for people to be able to influence and actually introduce fresh ideas or fresh areas they might talk about?
Well, you look at a case-by-case basis. What are the issues in a constituency? You've been selected there potentially to be the Member of Parliament. Well, it's a pretty good idea to know what the issues are. So looking back, we had lots of issues in my neck of the woods in Cheshire. We had fracking, we had high speed 2. NHS is always around, even if it's good. It's always an issue, isn't it? Because somebody's going to do something to it. So you had lots of big issues for me to get high energy costs. Unemployment was relatively high in 2010, and due to my jobs and apprenticeship fairs, it reduced and halved by 2015. So as a good candidate will look how they can influence something, whether it's inward investment or jobs and apprenticeship fairs, which you can commit to. I will represent you, and these are the campaigns that you have told me about, and I will represent those as best I can in Parliament if elected.
Yeah, and what kind of information helps support those cases?
Well, if a helpful public affairs company has briefed you on high speed 2 or fracking or the local NHS or whatever the issue is, then that is helpful to the candidate.
And I think from a public affairs consultancy perspective, you need information about people's track record of interest. You know, this is where doing your homework really matters. And there will be incumbents like Graham who had a specific list of issues that he'd worked on in the past. But for newer candidates, PPCs who've been recently selected or haven't run before for election, using their social media background and establishing what they're already interested in is obviously a starting point. I think all politics is local, and that's never more true than the general election, which means that bins, badger culls, knife crime, whatever it is going to be mostly local issues, and that's what their literature will be focused on often, particularly for Liberal Democrats. We're really good at this. But I think there are also always going to be national issues that cut through, and this election particularly, obviously we're talking about Brexit a lot. Well, the Lib Dems, Plaid, SNP and the Tories will be talking about Brexit a lot, the Labour Party possibly less, so they'll be trying to focus it more on the National Health Service. But you've got to do your research as a public affairs agency, you've got to be able, and that should all feed into your targeting strategy. Whether or not you can persuade PPCs to give support to those issues during the campaign, I mean, let's be realistic, it's 3 weeks to go. If you are starting a conversation now, the chance of you persuading them is more limited. But if you can give them simple ways to show that they are delivering or to articulate their values. So again, you know, it could just be as simple as hold this poster up and take a picture and tweet it. So you can be measuring the impact of tweets using campaign hashtags, but also it's the beginning of the conversation. And I think MPs they meet loads of people. They're particularly on the doorstep focused on whether or not they're cutting through in traction, and any sense of you're just here to be a prop for our campaign is going to fall a bit flat.
What is the best way or the best ways to cut through?
I mean, as Graham was talking about, there are, you particularly want to be in high footfall places. So if you can organise events in centres of towns or in places where you know there's going to be a lot of traffic, I think that really helps. If you've got a campaign roadshow, if your campaign has a specific enough ask, that's fantastic to be able to do that. I think the more realistic thing is to view it as the beginning of a conversation and build a relationship with somebody. And public affairs professionals are really good at building relationships and understanding the individuals, and that's what you're starting to do with these people.
Street stall, so pacing table. You can put a flag on it, Union Jack or whatever it is that you wish to put in there, and engaging in the people doing their shop any day of the week, for example, with a petition. So stop this from closing, or we want to bypass, or whatever the local issue you think you detected that the local people will sign for. And you'd be amazed how many people, when approached with a clipboard from a parliamentary candidate and helpers, will sign up to it, and you get a huge ability to communicate with the public. And of course, I learnt my trade against the Liberal Democrats in the 1990s, so I know the tricks of the trade, and all politics is local, down your street, and that is the key. However, they've only got 3 weeks. If you were selected last week, you've got to make that impression very, very quickly. And that's why I think a street stall in the town centre, knocking on doors and trying to get round as quickly as possible. Because these people haven't got incumbency, they've got no track record. From 2010 to 2015, I had a very good track record, and I came out with a very Lib Dem thing. It says, most politicians are full of words, this politician's full of numbers. And I listed all the things I'd achieved. So I'd done 6 marathons for charity, I'd 60 pints of blood for blood donation. So I looked at all the numbers, how many speeches I'd contributed in Parliament, how many questions, how many written questions, how many verbal questions, how many schools had visited. So I used all that work that's incumbency. It's a slightly different topic for this interview. But if you've got time, if you haven't got time, if you've got 3 weeks, you just really have to get a big bang for your buck.
Yes.
And that's hard work, street stalls, knocking on doors, shoe leather work.
And for public affairs people, the best way to support with that, I mean, how easy is that to do in practice? Because you've got to identify the right people in the first place.
Identify the people first, because otherwise you're just scattergunning. And you want to identify who can impact most for my company that I'm working for, and who may be those candidates. And I think that's the brightest and the best of the public affairs world will be looking who stood down, who's retired, who may replace them. I'm going to put my time in that. It may be half a dozen people, it may be a dozen people. It's not going to be huge numbers, but think about it very carefully, and don't scattergun, and don't make it generic, dear candidate.
And I think it's where good campaign craft really comes in. Do you have your data in order? Do you know where your local supporters are? Are you able to help create technical tools that make it easier for them to email their local MP in a way that doesn't feel like it's a generic spit out of the machine engagement tool? I think at Atlas Partners, one of the things that we're really focused on is trying to make sure that we use the digital campaigning tools as much as we use the sort of old traditional, like shoe leather and handshaking and face-to-face stuff, which is incredibly important. But I think public affairs really needs to understand how much more candidates themselves are using social media, particularly Facebook and Twitter, to communicate with their own communities, and that if there's a way to help them with their campaigns online, that's a really strong offer that you can make to them. So it could be as simple as interesting imagery that creates or makes good Facebook posts. But I think it's incumbent upon us as an industry to be open to those tools, and they are evolving all the time. And I think that modern campaigning technology is really important within, not just for the public affairs professional, but actually also for the candidates themselves, and understanding that they are still working out how to do that.
Yes, it's changing all the time, isn't it? I mean, even this election compared with 2 years ago, it's a different.
In 2010, I was told as a candidate I had to set up a Facebook account.
There you go,
Mrs. Evans had one for years, but so I had to set up a Facebook account. Same with Twitter. That was 2010. 2015, it came into its own. I understood the benefits of it. 2017, however, it'd be interesting to see what happens with social media, how it's seen as a positive or a negative, because I know in 2017, so I switched off my Twitter account, so vile and horrible, and I hope it's not the case now, because you have to use new technology to communicate with the electorate, but unfortunately it's been used and abused, which isn't helpful for public affairs, which is what we're about, but also it's not really good for democracy, that you can't disagree with people without being disagreeable.
And it's where we really borrow from our kind of colleagues from the public relations industry, where the storytelling there and the visual storytelling is so much more highly evolved. I think public affairs professionals can be a bit behind the curve sometimes on visual storytelling, and using video and imagery to tell your campaign story is really, really important, and that plays much better in the sort of more friendly social media channels like Instagram and Facebook, rather than necessarily shouting into the void with everybody else on Twitter.
No, Instagram definitely has a place, and I say there'll be other things in the future. So it'd be interesting to see how public affairs and social media pan out in this election, and see what because that, I think, is clearly the future. But it can be really hostile for a new candidate selected last week, 3 weeks to go, who have not been used to public reaction to their tweets.
It's very direct,
and their postings. So that is a new phenomena, perhaps.
So are there ways that public affairs professionals can help mitigate some of that, or help people navigate that?
You mean in terms of the abuse online?
Well, not necessarily abuse, but just if it is something that's a bit new and all of a sudden there's direct contact, are there ways that public affairs can help? Or
I mean, I think that it's the same skill set that we've always used, which is understanding your audience and knowing how to persuade them, and that it's no different on social to on the doorstep, actually, and that the candidate's best armoury is being authentically themselves, and that you therefore as an advisor wouldn't want to suggest that they take on something that doesn't feel true to them. That means I think some of the candidates who are standing down this time around, it's because they don't believe in the project anymore. So they're not up for the fight anymore. I think it doesn't make the fight any less difficult. And there's some brilliant organisations like Glitch that have been set up to help candidates manage that sort of less attractive side of social media, the sort of ugly trolling, and I think resilience and self-care are really important for candidates in this day and age, but actually you have to know what you're standing for and why you're standing in order to withstand that, which means that as a public affairs professional trying to engage with those individuals, you have to be able to identify what people really genuinely care about, and that's how you're going to persuade them, and that hasn't changed. That's the same.
What sort of leeway do candidates have, and again in terms of their interaction with public affairs potentially, to depart from the party line in practice? Or I mean, in terms of the engagement, what can that look like?
Well, you're standing on a manifesto, or you will be next week. So the general idea is that you believe in Lib Dem principles, or Labour, Conservative, or whatever. So the broad brush. But as a candidate, speaking personally in a marginal seat, David Cameron couldn't tell me how to win Weaver Vale. Only really I knew how to win Weaver Vale. So you can put things round the sides, and you can talk with authority if you've done your homework. I was a candidate for 3 years. You really do know your stuff. If elected, I will campaign on this subject. If elected, I will make sure we get this inward investment, or whatever it is. That's not going off the party line. What that is, as you said earlier, that's pavement politics. Campaigning on behalf of the individual communities, and it'll be potentially several different communities. Different things mean to different communities, and that's how I got an 8.1% swing, if I can just say that, is because I was seen as a local chap campaigning on local issues, pavement politics, and I was, like I say, 8.1% swing, very successful campaigning on local issues. There were other factors, I accept that, but at the margins, the candidate can tip that over from remaining one party and moving to ours. So it was a safe Labour seat with a 7,000 majority, and I won it with 991 with an 8.1% swing. I worked very hard for 5 years to reduce my majority to 806, and the reason why is because of payment politics, omnipresent, campaigning on the things that matter to your electorate. But that's not necessarily disagreeing with the governments. If you looked at, I voted with the government on most things. I wasn't a rebel. You do not need to be a rebel, because what you're doing in Parliament's one thing, supporting the government, the coalition government, which I thought was a successful coalition, but at the same time you're campaigning in your constituency. So they're two different things. You don't need to be a rebel. In my experience, people choose to be rebels.
I mean, I think you're
absolutely right. It's a career choice.
Parties are generally a broad church, and manifestos generally provide a really broad spectrum platform for people to stand on. And then what they choose to highlight themselves individually probably chimes most with local priorities. So you'll get lots of people talking about closures of local hospitals if that's an issue for them. I did a lot of work supporting our PPC in Sutton and Cheam in 2017, Amna Ahmed, and she managed to get the sort of trifecta between locally campaigning against the third runway for Heathrow, which helped her locally because it was a big issue on the doorsteps, but also allowed her to reinforce the party's line nationally and also to reinforce the kind of party's environmental credentials.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing that public affairs professionals should be looking at, sort of where is that crossover between a candidate's local agenda, the national manifesto commitments, and then the sort of, does it make a good picture? And she managed to get, the front page of the local newspaper as a result of that, which is, PPC gold, basically.
Yeah, and presumably that stuff can be, that doesn't, public affairs professionals aren't waiting for a general election to be called to be doing that kind of work anyway, so that stuff's ready to go.
I mean, we were talking earlier about how mostly when you say, what should you be doing to engage with PPCs? You say, well, you shouldn't be starting 3 weeks out from the election.
Absolutely right. I noticed when I got elected, I had an idea of what I wanted to be known for locally, the local industry, but I noticed the charity sector. You got inundated with charity public affairs people wanting you to get involved and sign up for this, that, and
during the campaign?
No, afterwards. After the campaign. The public a lot of public affairs organisations wait until after the election, which is fine, but I think that's perhaps a little bit lazy, because you can have an opportunity to communicate with all those candidates, and even if they didn't win, they will go back to their day jobs and they may come back, but they're aware of your charity. So I think it's a good way for charities to
lay the ground.
And I don't know whether this was true for you, but I know a lot of the new MPs who do then get elected, there's this sort of weird system within the House of Commons that you don't immediately get assigned an office because it's assigned by order of precedence. So if you're the new kids on the block, you might be waiting up to 2 or 3 weeks for an office, which means that this flood of correspondence that's arriving because you are now the MP is actually being dealt with sort of sitting in somebody else's office, or it's being sent to your constituency. And I think that's partly why friends and colleagues have said, actually, those who wrote to me before, I really remember, because otherwise you get this huge stack and then you're just one of hundreds.
Yeah, so
that's true. 6 weeks it took me to get an office. No staff, no office, nowhere to live.
But you did remember the people that had got in touch with you beforehand.
Yes. The relationship struck up from 2010 tended to go. I particular muscular dystrophy was one for me, because I had a relative who died of it. Heart, my dad died of heart, so there was I had pre-ideas of what I wanted to get involved in if I was to become an MP, but that was more of a personal choice rather than a constituency choice. But I have to say, there's a couple of organisations who I think Matt Millen did a fantastic job on the coffee mornings. Which MP does not want to go to a coffee morning in their constituency? So I noticed certain charities were certainly better at it.
And make it easy for the
make it very easy for candidates and subsequently MPs to engage in a very good charity. Matt Millen, I think, was one of those that really made it easy. What you have to do as a public affairs, you have to make it easy for the MP or the candidate to engage with you. So if you're going to invite them, make it easy for them to
give
visit.
Them what they need, make it easy, build a long-lasting.
Well, they're there to do good, but they also want to be seen to be doing good.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I'm afraid we're out of time, actually. That's flown by. So thank you very, very much for joining me. And thank you very much for watching.